I am not, by temperament, a man who acts without calculating the consequence 3 moves ahead, and I have been called the deliberate Duke by everyone from my own steward to the wits of whites for the better part of a decade, on grounds I have never once disputed. I tell you this so you will understand precisely how strange it was, even to me, when I found myself standing in a moneylender's back office in Cheapside on an ordinary Tuesday, informing a man I had met 4 minutes before that I would be settling his entire debt myself, on terms I had not yet worked out and offered in that moment, without calculating anything at all. My name is Alastair Crane, Duke of Northwood, and this is the whole of how I came to marry a printshop owner's daughter I had known, at the time I made that decision, for exactly the length of one conversation. I had earned the epithet honestly, over a decade of never once signing a contract, accepting a wager, or committing to a course of action without first working through every consequence I could anticipate, sometimes at length enough to exasperate my own solicitor. I had turned down 3 separate marriage proposals from perfectly eligible young women over the preceding 5 seasons on the grounds that I could not yet calculate, to my own satisfaction, whether the match would hold its value across a lifetime rather than a season, a habit my sister found maddening and my mother found, on her more charitable days, merely exhausting. I had gone to Cheapside that Tuesday on unrelated business, a dispute over a shipment of Northwood paper stock that had gone astray somewhere between the mill and my own printing concern, a small enterprise I kept more out of interest than necessity, and had been directed to Mr. Grissom's office to trace the missing invoices. I had not expected to find, in the front room of that same office, a printshop owner named Josiah Redmayne pressed white-faced against the counter, while Grissom's clerk read aloud, in the flat voice of a man reciting a transaction he found entirely unremarkable, the terms under which Mr. Redmayne's daughter would enter the household of a distant Grissom relation in Islington to work off her father's outstanding debt of £40, at a rate of wages so low the arrangement would not conclude. By the clerk's own arithmetic, for the better part of 4 years. Grissom's reputation in that quarter of Cheapside was not a kind one. I had heard him spoken of twice already that morning, by 2 separate tradesmen waiting on their own business, as a man who structured his terms deliberately to be misunderstood by debtors too frightened or too poorly educated to check his arithmetic, and who had more than once arranged for a debtor's daughter or niece to settle a family debt through service rather than coin, a practice that skirted the letter of the law closely enough that no magistrate had yet troubled to stop it. The daughter in question, Miss Sophia Redmayne, stood beside her father with the particular stillness of a person who has decided, out of necessity, that showing fear will only make a bad situation worse. She was perhaps 22, plainly but neatly dressed in a printer's daughter's practical wool, and she was, I noted even in that first strange minute, following the clerk's arithmetic with far more attention than her father was managing, and had already, by the look on her face, found an error in it. "Your figures are wrong," she said, before I had said a single word myself. "You have compounded the interest monthly rather than the quarterly rate stated in my father's original note. At the correct rate, the debt stands nearer £31 than 40. The clerk informed her, with the weary condescension of a man long accustomed to debtors' daughters attempting arithmetic they did not properly understand, that the calculation had been performed by Mr. Grissom himself, and was not open to dispute by a printer's clerk's daughter. I have spent the whole of my adult life around men who manage figures for a living, solicitors, stewards, my own man of business, and I knew within perhaps 10 seconds of watching her trace the clerk's ledger with one gloved finger and name the exact line where the error occurred, that Miss Redmayne was entirely correct, and that Mr. Grissom's clerk was either incompetent or dishonest, and I did not in that moment much care which. "The young lady is right," I said. "I should like to see the original note myself if you would be so good as to produce it." The clerk, recognizing a duke's tailoring when it stood directly in front of him, produced the note within the minute. Miss Redmayne's arithmetic proved correct to the shilling. I informed Mr. Grissom, once he had been fetched from his inner office in some haste, that I would be settling the corrected sum of £31 myself, in full that afternoon, and that I expected a written release of Mr. Redmayne's debt and any obligation attached to it, including, and I made this point with what I am told was considerable coldness, any arrangement touching upon his daughter's person or labor, which I did not consider a legitimate object of commercial exchange under any circumstance whatsoever. Mr. Grissom himself protested the correction with considerably more heat than the sum warranted, informing me that gentlemen did not, as a rule, involved themselves in the fine print of a tradesman's private arrangements, to which I replied that a duke who owned a printing concern involved himself precisely as much as he pleased in fine print, and that I found his particular fine print considerably more offensive than most. I paid the £31. I did not, I should be clear, expect anything in return for it beyond the release itself, and I told Mr. Redmayne so directly, in terms I hoped left no room for the misunderstanding I could see forming on his face, that I had not purchased his daughter's service, only extinguished a debt I found offensively mismanaged, and that both he and Miss Redmayne were free to walk out of that office and never think of me again if that was their preference. It was Miss Redmayne, not her father, who answered me. "You have just spent £31 you will never see returned, Your Grace, on strangers you met not 20 minutes ago, over an arithmetic error most gentlemen of your rank would not have troubled themselves to notice, let alone correct in a moneylender's favour rather than their own. I do not think you did that expecting nothing at all. I think you did it because it offended you to watch a wrong sum stand uncorrected, which is, I will note, not nothing. It is simply a different kind of payment than the one you're declining to name. I have been called many things by many people in the course of a long public life, but I do not believe anyone had ever, before that Tuesday, correctly diagnosed my own motives back to me within the first half-hour of our acquaintance, and I confess, I did not entirely know what to do with a young woman who had. You are not wrong, I admitted. I find uncorrected arithmetic considerably more offensive than most men find outright theft, which is, I am aware, an eccentric ordering of priorities. I would, however, genuinely welcome the chance to make it a fairer payment than the one you've named, if you would permit it. My library at Northwood has stood without a proper catalogue for 11 years, my late father's collection, some 4,000 volumes, entirely unsorted since his death, and I have never once found a clerk both trustworthy enough and precise enough to set it in order. I would pay a fair wage, name your terms yourself, and you would be free to leave at any time, for any reason, with no obligation attached beyond the work itself." Mr. Redmayne, recovering something of his composure, began to object that his daughter had never worked as a librarian in her life, and had no experience to recommend her for so particular a post, and that a gentleman's household was, in any case, no fit place for an unmarried woman without a chaperone of her own rank to vouch for the arrangement. "I have kept my father's shop account since I was 14, Sophia said, corrected 2 independent errors in a moneylender's ledger within the last quarter hour, and read every book that has passed through our shop for want of anything else to do with a slow afternoon. I do not believe cataloguing 4,000 volumes by author and subject requires a credential beyond patience and an orderly mind, both of which I possess in some quantity, Papa." I learned in the course of that same conversation a little more of the Redmayne circumstance than either of them likely intended me to, that Josiah Redmayne's small print shop off Paternoster Row had lost the greater part of its custom the previous winter when a fire 2 doors down took half the street's trade with it, that the £40 debt to Grissom had been borrowed in desperation to replace a ruined press, and that Sophia had in the 18 months since kept the family's books, negotiated with 2 other creditors on her father's behalf, and taught herself enough Latin from the shop's own stock to correct printers' proofs for a small additional fee, all while her father grew, by her own careful account, less and less capable of managing the shop's affairs himself. She took the post. She named her own terms, a fair wage, a fortnight's notice on either side, and a room of her own rather than the servants' quarters, on the grounds that a woman cataloguing a gentleman's library at all hours ought not to answer to housekeeper's curfew, and I agreed to every one of them without argument, which my own steward later informed me was the single fastest negotiation he had ever witnessed me conclude. She arrived at Northwood the following Monday with 2 trunks, a notebook already half filled with a proposed classification system, and a composure that unsettled the housekeeper considerably more than any amount of nervousness would have done, and spent the better part of the next 8 months proving, exhaustively and to my very great satisfaction, that I had underpaid considerably for what she was worth. My sister, Lady Frances Ellerby, raised the matter within a fortnight of Sophia's arrival, over tea in the Northwood morning room, in the particular tone she reserved for subjects she considered beneath open argument but not beneath comment. A duke's library does not require a resident young woman to catalogue it, Alastair, whatever the state of father's collection. You could hire a university man for the purpose and avoid a great deal of talk. I informed her, with what I hoped was sufficient finality, that I had already interviewed 2 university men for the post the previous year, that both had proposed a classification system inferior to the one Miss Redmayne had sketched out within her first week, and that I did not intend to sacrifice competence to avoid gossip I considered, on reflection, nobody's business but my own. My sister did not raise the subject again, though I noticed she took considerably longer than usual, on her next visit, deciding whether to approve of Sophia in person, and left, in the end, rather more impressed than she had arrived. I did not court her, in those 8 months, in any sense either of us would have recognized as courtship at the time. I called on the library most evenings, ostensibly to review her progress, and found myself staying considerably longer than the progress warranted, arguing with her over whether my father's collection of continental agricultural surveys belonged under husbandry or under natural philosophy, a debate that consumed, by my own steward's dry count, 11 separate evenings without resolution. There was, besides the agricultural surveys, the matter of my father's correspondence, 3 locked boxes of it discovered behind a false shelf back in October, which Sophia catalogued with a discretion I had not expected and came, in the process, to know my late father, a man I had lost at 19 and scarcely had the chance to know as an adult, considerably better than I had managed in 19 years of being his son. She would read me a passage some evenings, when she judged it fit for sharing, and I found myself, more than once, sitting rather later than any filing question could account for simply to hear the next one. "You are not actually interested in where the agricultural surveys belong, Your Grace," she told me, somewhere around the 9th evening, not looking up from the ledger she was correcting. "You are interested in an excuse to sit in this library past dinner, and I confess I have begun to find the surveys a rather thin pretext for it." "They are a perfectly legitimate cataloguing question," I said, with as much dignity as I could manage. "They are," she agreed. "They are also not the reason you are here at 9 in the evening for the 3rd night running, when you employ a perfectly competent housekeeper who could review my progress reports at any hour that did not require your own presence." I did not deny it a second time. "I find," I said, "that I have grown considerably more interested in your opinion of the agricultural surveys than in the surveys themselves, and I am not entirely certain what to do with a fact I did not calculate for and cannot seem to correct." "You could simply say so plainly," she said, "rather than disguising it as a filing dispute for 11 evenings running. I begin to suspect the deliberate Duke is considerably less deliberate than his reputation suggests, when the subject under deliberation is one he would rather not examine too closely." "I examine everything closely," I said. "It is, I am beginning to understand, the examining itself I have been avoiding, because a filing dispute can be settled and set aside, and what I actually feel for you, Miss Redmayne, does not appear to be the kind of thing that settles." She set down her pen, for the first time in 11 evenings, without correcting a single figure. "Then I would suggest, Your Grace, that you stop filing it under husbandry and call it what it actually is." There followed a silence in that library longer than any of our 11 evenings of filing debate had produced, broken only by the settling of the fire, and somewhere below us, the ordinary sounds of a household going on about its evening, as though nothing at all had just been said aloud for the first time. I will confess that I did not even then propose with any particular speed, old habits, as she herself had diagnosed, being difficult to correct even once identified, and it was nearly 2 months more, through a winter of continued evenings in that library, before I asked her properly, on the evening we finally finished the last shelf of the catalogue together, both of us dust-streaked and considerably more pleased with the achievement than either of us let on. 4,000 volumes, I said, sorted, corrected, and catalogued to a standard my father's own librarian never achieved in 30 years of trying. I find I am not remotely ready for the evenings to end simply because the work has. "Then I would suggest, Your Grace," she said, echoing her own words back to me with a small, deliberate smile, "that you stop filing this under cataloguing and call it what it actually is." "Sophia Redmayne," I said, "will you marry me not out of any debt owed, real or imagined, but because I have spent 8 months discovering that I would rather argue with you about agricultural surveys than agree with anyone else about anything?" She said yes with the same unhurried precision she brought to every ledger she had ever corrected, which is to say, she considered the question with evident seriousness for a long moment, weighed it fully, and then answered it exactly and without qualification. And I have never in my life been more satisfied by an arithmetic result. Her father gave her away that spring, not in the print shop after all but in the parish church around the corner from it, freshly repaired with money I confess I provided without either of them ever quite catching me at it, and insisted the wedding breakfast cards be printed on his own restored press as his gift to us both. A small, defiant flourish of trade craftsmanship among the Northwood silver that my sister, to her credit, pronounced the finest thing on the table. I keep one of those cards still, framed beside the completed library catalogue in my study, as the two proofs I trust most in this world that a sum, worked carefully enough, and occasionally abandoned at exactly the right moment, will always come out right in the end.